All right. Well, hey, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I'm really delighted to have Frederic Durbin with us today. He's going to be discussing the brand new book, The Country Under Heaven. Remarkable, remarkable book. So, Fred, welcome. It's great to meet you.
Thank you very much. It's great to meet you, and it's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to say congrats on the publication of your book. It came out, the release date was yesterday,
Yes.
May 13th. And let me just read a little bit of your bio here. You've had a very interesting story. It says Frederick Durbin is the author of three novels and short story collections for adults and children. His novel, A Green and Ancient Light, was named a Publishers Weekly Best Fantasy Science Fiction Horror Book of the Year, an ALA Reading List Honor Book, and it won a Realm Award. Um, Durbin taught English and creative writing at, is it Niigata?
Yes, that's right.
Niigata University in Japan for over 20 years before relocating back to the United States. And yeah, this, as I was saying, this new book, I wanted to just to kind of get the ball rolling by talking about kind of the origin story of this particular book, how you came to write it. It really has the feel of a fever dream. Um, did the Crather, is that how you say it? The
That's
Crather
that's
possess
perfect.
did it possess you and demand that you write this story?
I don't think it was so much the Crather. I think it was maybe Ovid Vesper himself.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well,
Yes.
why don't you just briefly kind of tell the watchers what the book is about, when it's set, and so
Sure.
forth.
Okay. So it tells the story of a main character named Ovid Vesper. And Ovid is a Union veteran of the Civil War. He fought in the Civil War. And the book is happening about 20 years after the war, during the decade of the 1880s. During the war at the Battle of Antietam, Ovid was kind of caught in an explosion and blown off his feet, blown through the air. And ever since regained consciousness, he's had a mysterious set of visions that seem to be leading him somewhere. So as the book unfolds, we're following him around as he travels around the Old West of the 1880s, being led by these visions that he doesn't fully understand. And at the same time, when that explosion happened and he was briefly hovering between life and death, he feels that some kind of presence or entity followed him back into the waking world from some other world. And he calls it the Crather, which is Ovid's way of saying creature. And he doesn't know what it is or what it wants, but it seems to show up when he least expects it. And all sorts of weirdness happens. So, on the one hand, it's a Western story. There's the typical Western action, outlaws, gunfights, things like that. But it's also a tale of Ovid's encounters with the supernatural. And he's not really a typical Western gunslinger. He's almost more like a wandering pastor because he
Yes.
always seems to run into people with problems. Some of them are old friends of his, some of them aren't. And he tries to help where he can. And so he's usually helping people with some kind of monster or ghost or other supernatural thing they're dealing with. So
And
it's a lot
he
of
has,
fun.
yeah, it's this journey where these various different episodes kind of, I love the structure of the book, these vignettes, you kind of, and the time period that you place them in is so fascinating. That 1880s period. I think the book starts in 1881. And does it end in the early 1890s? Is that right?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
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 And what a fascinating time. The end of the frontier period. The Indian Wars are finally, I think in 1886, Geronimo's kind of surrender or whatever
Yeah.
ends the Indian Wars, and then Wounded Knee happens a few years later. But it's this really interesting period of, railroad trains are taking over and connecting the country. And
Yeah.
the modern era is starting to kind of, its presence is being felt.
Hmm. Hmm.
Talk a little bit about researching and setting it during this period.
Yeah. Well, that's an era that's always fascinated me too, because it's a relatively brief period. And as you said, so much is changing during that time. Ways of life are vanishing, rails are being laid. Some of the wilderness is disappearing in a sense. I mean, there's so much out there that it didn't really disappear, but we're
Right.
coming to the borders of it. We're understanding it more. And yeah, it's a time I think if we have something like a mythology in this country, I would say it's the Western, at
Sure.
least at least for white people. The white man's mythology is the Western. I know there are older mythologies in place, but um, it's what we have instead of a medieval lore or a fairy lore. And in many ways, our cowboy stories, they're kind of like knights errant. They're kind of like King Arthur's knights, the lone man riding around doing some good where he can. And yeah, so it's a fascinating era. It seems to me that Westerns, they all kind of feel like elegies to me, like they're these sad, beautiful songs of things that are being lost and changing. And yeah, just a fascinating time period to work with, I think. And it's
That's
all set
interesting.
against this beautiful scenery. You have these
Yeah.
epic backdrops, and it's in a country that is largely lawless. A person with personal integrity and goodness can make a lot of difference. So it's just the stories almost tell themselves.
That's interesting. I never really quite thought about it that way as far as the Western, being an elegy, that something is, we're in a transitional period,
Yeah.
something is being lost. And then the events are being mythologized so quickly. Uh,
Yes.
it's incredible. It's like, thinking about the Buffalo Bill Wild West show or something,
Hmm.
being sent on tour all over the world,
Yeah.
some with participants of some of these battles that have just happened. And like the
Yeah.
myth is being created in real time almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then over in England, you have this really interesting, um, thinking of the writers of that era, and you got the spiritualist movement happening, and you've got, the body snatchers, and so for the purposes of, writing a, a novel, there all kinds of elements come into this book, uh,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yes.
and that's kind of what you, at least to my knowledge, what you focus mainly on has been kind of speculative fiction, for lack of a better. I
Yes.
mean, we hate to put things into categories, but
Sure. But no, that I think that's fair. Yeah, I typically have not written Westerns before, so this is kind of a first. Um, but yes, I do love fantasy. I grew up reading things like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and just all sorts of fantasy. Fantasy, of course, is a really broad category with all kinds of stories can be called fantasy. And to me, it feels like the most real genre. I heard the writer Peter Straub one time say that we read and write fantasy because it's the genre most capable of showing us life as it really is.
isn't
And
that
I think that's an interesting thought that in one way or in some ways fantasy is the most realistic genre because I think we live in a supernatural world. You know, miraculous things happen all the time. Every family has stories of weird coincidences and maybe a ghost or two. So yeah, and I think it allows us to tell stories of the most real aspects of the human experience and the human struggle. So I think it just gives you a great canvas to work with.
sure? I was thinking about, and we'll get into a little bit about Ovid himself and what happens to him at Antietam. And as you say, it's almost like uh, something is ripped open.
Yes.
Time is ripped open, and something, you know, uh,
Yeah.
the world is kind of put a tilt on its axis a little bit.
Right.
And you hear that a lot with people that are veterans that have gone through these. I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking, Ovid could very easily be a Vietnam vet, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
traveling through late 1970s, 80s,
Yeah.
America.
Yes, that's true.
Does that seem accurate?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the origin story of the book. How did it start speaking with you? Did the idea of a novel come fully formed, or did it start out of a short story?
You know what's really interesting? Well, first of all, I should say that it's been unique for me in that I'm typically a writer of setting. I'm a writer of place, and it's usually some place that first appeals to me. And as I begin to explore a place, then all the other elements come: the characters, the action, the plot, things like that. This was the first time it was the main character's voice that came to me first.
Okay.
It was almost like this cowboy was just standing beside me and he started speaking, and he just had this story to tell, and I basically just wrote it down. You're right, it didn't start as a novel. It started as a short story, and it was for an anthology contest. um,
Okay.
Jason Waltz did some years ago did a contest for an anthology he called Challenge Discovery, and he had an illustration for the cover, and the illustration showed sort of like an Amazon style woman warrior standing in a jungle with a Black Panther. And when I saw the picture, I that weekend I think I had seen a couple of Western movies and I was thinking about Westerns. And I thought, I'm going to write a Western for this contest because I know no one else will. No one seeing that picture will write a Western. So I did. And it was a form of what is now the book's penultimate chapter, the Someplace Cool and Dark, it's called.
Okay.
That was the origin of Ovid Vesper.
Is
And
that
then
right? Okay.
a few years went by and it felt like Ovid wasn't done speaking to me. So then I began to write these other stories. What's now the first chapter of the book was written for an anthology. It was actually an anthology that I helped co-edit. I was a co-editor for the Cold Hard Type fiction anthology series, and it's an idea of people who love typewriters. You can see a row of
Yeah.
vintage typewriters behind me here. I am a typewriter enthusiast, and so for this anthology, we wanted to get people using their typewriters to dust them off, to use them as they were intended, and write stories that somehow involved a typewriter. And so that was kind of my example story, or because there's a typewriter has a minor role in chapter one of the book. So it grew from a number of places. And then I began to realize I think Ovid has a big story here that is more than just a couple of short stories. So if it feels episodic, you're absolutely right. It started as kind of a novel in stories. And then I did some work to try to unify that and make it a whole thing.
Right. And to my knowledge, the whole book is told in first person. Is that correct? There's no detachment. You don't
Right.
see anybody else's perspective,
That's true.
is
That's
which
true.
which is really interesting because it's intimate, but and you get to be kind of looking at the world through his eyes. Uh, how
Thank
how
you.
how was that? Did you try
Yeah.
doing a third person?
No, I didn't. His voice was so strong for me from the beginning that I didn't really feel like I created it. It just I could hear it.
It was
And I do tend to write novels from first person perspective because I think it allows me to get much more inside the character's head. This is just the character speaking to you. It's I'm not trying to use third person and tell you what someone else is doing. I'm writing from
right,
this I perspective, and for me that seems to work better.
right. Yeah, it would be hard, I think, for a third person point of view to kind of look at, or an omniscient kind of viewpoint to try to say, well, Ovid then, had this vision of, that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
right, right.
I mean, it could, yeah. Anyway,
And I think it just allows you to explore more things, more nuances of feeling and thought and things that are a little harder when you're outside the character.
and also gives the opportunity for a slightly unreliable narrator.
Right.
You
Yeah, we're
know,
never sure quite whether we
right?
should believe everything he's saying.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, I was going to ask you about some of the influences on the book. You do have some, there are some people that have done, I'm thinking of Dan Simmons as a good example,
Yeah.
or certainly Joe Lansdale,
Yes.
and even, did you ever read Theodore Sturgeon's great Western stories?
I haven't. I've been meaning to, but I haven't yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and then, obviously one thinks of Lovecraft, and
Mm.
I thought a little bit of Algernon Blackwood.
Oh yes. Yeah. I
And
grew up loving Blackwood stories.
interesting. Yeah. So what were some of the kind of some of the influences that went into this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, monsters. Ever since I was a little kid, I've loved monster stories. Like the movie King Kong, the old, 1930s version of King Kong in black and white. I was fascinated by this idea of an island that's not on any charts with this gigantic wall across the middle of it. Why is that wall there? Why do we need this gigantic wall with a huge gate in it? So things like that, mysteries, monsters, dinosaurs, any stories like that, I just devoured as a kid. And yes, H.P. Lovecraft. He's a writer that I was first drawn as a kid, probably in about fifth or sixth grade, maybe. Um, my parents owned a small town bookstore, and so I would see the covers of the books on the shelves. And I was just intrigued by the grotesque covers on Lovecraft books. I mean, it's exactly what a little boy is drawn to and wants to
Sure.
read, and but he's a writer that I can still read now as an adult, and you understand him more, I think. So certainly Lovecraft, as you said, Algernon Blackwood, stories like the Willows and the Wendigo. Uh,
Right.
yeah, just pretty much any monster story. And then at the same time, my dad, for some reason, loved the Old West, which is kind of mysterious because we lived in Illinois and I was a kid in like the 70s and 80s. And so uh, I sometimes say my dad was like a frustrated cowboy. He was born too late and too far east. But as a young man, he was writing poems about guys on the trail and coyotes howling over lonely canyons and stuff. So he would tell me stories about the Old West. So it was just kind of always in my ears and in my consciousness as I was growing up.
Hmm.
As you say, the weird Western is not a new thing. It's a genre that's been around from at least the 1930s, I think, and it probably peaked a while back. So it's really not in fashion nowadays, which is why my agent wisely calls this book a historical fantasy, not a weird Western.
You never know. I mean, I think you might be ahead of the curve.
Well,
Um,
the Western never really goes away. I mean, it's
no, no,
probably a lot of things like that come in cycles or waves.
definitely, definitely. And the character, the loner, that character is really an archetype that at the end of the Old West, he traded in his horse for, a fedora and a gun and became our hard-boiled detective.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's the same character
I guess yeah, that's a
at
good
the
point.
end, sort of standing against, all the conventional wisdom uh, and so forth.
Yeah,
I love that period, though. You're right, though. In the 20s and 30s with the pulp
yeah,
magazines,
yeah.
before television, you
Hmm.
know, entertainment. I mean, the racks were just packed with all these great
Oh
pulp
yeah,
magazines, and the covers were fantastic.
yeah.
Um, but
And
yeah,
there was
anything that you could do, weird tales, horror tales, detective.
kind of the more sensational, the better sometimes.
Exactly.
The penny dreadfuls and the
And right, exactly. It's
and there
so
was a time when
fascinating.
writers could make a living just writing short stories.
Right,
Ray Bradbury, when he started, was churning out a story a week and selling them to these magazines. You
exactly.
could sort of make a living at it.
And you went where the market was.
Yeah.
You wrote all these different kinds of things.
Mm.
Do you know, speaking of typewriters and somebody who does everything, do you know Lauren Estelman by chance? Are you
Mm.
familiar with him?
That name is very familiar.
Lauren D. Estelman. You should check him out because he writes westerns, he writes old school detective stuff, and he's
Okay.
a massive typewriter enthusiast.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
he doesn't have a computer. His wife, if you reach him, if you want to contact Lauren, you have to go through his wife, who has the
Okay.
no, but really amazing writer.
Okay.
I think you'd like his stuff.
So last name was Estelman. What's the first name?
Estelman, Lauren, Loren,
Okay.
Lauren D. Estelman.
Got it. Thank you.
Terrific stuff. Um, so I want to ask you about the visions themselves,
Okay.
and we don't have to do any spoilers or anything, but what Ovid goes through, this sort of transformation that when the visions kind of come upon him.
Mhm.
When you were doing some research on this subject, did you
Mhm.
come across, various different visionaries who, how did you get that right?
Hmm. That really wasn't an aspect that I researched so much, I think. I did all sorts of research on the land itself. Like, because Ovid is traveling around so much, I wanted to get the places right. I wanted them to come alive for readers. So I
Right.
needed to see pictures of trees and flowering plants to know what was in bloom in different states at different times. So I did that sort of research. And then, of course, at that time, you have to be really careful about what's a state and what's still a territory. So
Mm,
things like that, and details about the Civil War, I was learning about.
yeah,
I don't know that I really explored anything about visions or how to do that. I
just
just sort
came
of, that stuff just came, or I made it up, or
made it up, right?
yeah.
Well, I was thinking about, have you ever read Black Elk Speaks?
No, I've heard of it.
Yeah, well, there's the character is this boy who, this Lakota boy who during his early, I think he's around 12 or something, maybe 13, 14, but he is suddenly seized with these visions.
Mm-hmm.
It's about him, just going inward. And a lot of what he wrote about in that book, it's a beautiful book. Um, I said, wow, Fred's really read Black Elk Speaks, because a lot of what, sort of that, as it takes hold of him, the visions take hold. It
Oh,
reminded me
okay.
very much of Black Elk,
Okay.
but
Wow.
no.
Well, now my homework list is growing here. I want to check that out.
Yeah. So, so the various different episodes that he goes through,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about them? You sort of take him all over the West,
Hmm.
Colorado to Kansas, and these different
Yeah.
things happen, he gets involved with.
And that was fun too. The fact that he's moving around in every chapter, uh, it always felt new to me. Every chapter, I was dealing with new characters and a new situation, and yeah, I can't even really say how that all came together, because I really don't know. Often, often by researching some of the details of the places, that would suggest some stories to me. There's also a lot of there are some elements of folklore in the story.
Oh yeah,
For example, like in one chapter, it's called "The Sound of Bells," where Ovid meets. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but he meets a pair of kind of mysterious children. And that's based on a real medieval account of something that supposedly actually happened in the Middle Ages. That
really?
that two children very much like that were found. I even preserved some of the names from the original account. But yeah, if you look it up, that name Woolpit, and like Google the children of Woolpit.
Okay, I'll have to do that.
There's one more
Wow.
adjective that I don't want to add because it is a spoiler, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Right, right.
Like if you describe the children.
Yeah. Well, you play with some like real deep mythological material here, the snake pit, and kind of
Yeah.
tapping into some of our primal fears that we
Yeah.
all have maybe.
Oh, I think the very first movie I saw was the old True Grit, the John Wayne
Oh
True Grit.
yeah,
My parents took me to see it when I was a toddler. I was very young. They took me to a drive-in theater, and really the only thing I remember from that movie is the snake pit and just being traumatized by that as a kid.
definitely.
Yeah.
One of my favorites is it may be the first or the second episode where he goes on the cattle drive.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he's involved with the cattle drive up to Dodge City, and they encounter trying to this peculiar cannibal barefoot people
Yes,
in the
yes.
cave, and these night hunters.
Yeah.
Um, but there, he goes down into the cave, and all this
Hmm.
seems very, very rich metaphor or mythological terrain here.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a fun chapter to write too, just learning about how cattle drives actually worked.
Mm,
Learning about chuck wagons and how many men you needed, how many cattle were typically along, what the conditions were, how far they went in a day, things like
right.
that. So yeah, just a lot of fun. And yeah, it does have like mythological sort of overtones to it. Because at one
Mm,
point the trail boss says he feels like he's leading the children of Israel.
right.
So just this epic journey of a great herd of animals and the guys traveling over the great distances.
Right. Exactly. And he always has his gallant horse, Jack.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a bit of a stretch that his one horse survives all these years of journeying, constant journey, and is still okay at the end. um,
Right.
I love that detail, but I'm not sure that's 100% realistic.
Eh,
But
that's
maybe.
okay.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that struck me also is, you mentioned studying up on all the flora and fauna and the language. I wanted to ask you about the language you used for the book. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it's very lush, and people would call it lyrical. But there's also an interesting sort of spareness to it.
Mm-hmm.
You managed to pull that off, which I thought was really,
Well,
really neat.
thank you. That's
And it reveals, what I took away from it was just that this idea that the people had a much more intimate relationship with the natural world
yeah.
that,
Yes, that
yeah,
is true. Yeah, when especially in the kind of life Ovid is living, where so much of it is outdoors, yeah, people are probably more aware of nature and they watch the sky more carefully and they're aware of the temperature and the conditions.
they're more participating in
Yes,
the natural world
yeah,
and
yeah. There's a
detached from it.
there's a great book. Um, I think it's called At Day's Close or something like that. It's by a writer named Roger Ekirk or Ekirch, and he made it an academic study over many years of the pre-industrial night, like what night was like for people before we had the electric light bulb, and just how differently people thought about the night, differences in the way they lived. He investigated a lot of firsthand sources of letters from people and writing of the time. Like, for one thing, this idea of going to bed at, say, anywhere from 9 p.m. to midnight and sleeping through the night is a relatively new idea. That's like come since industrialization, that in older times people had what they called the first sleep and the second sleep. And basically they would go to sleep when the sun went down because it got dark. And then there was this period of a couple or 3 hours in the middle of the night when they would wake up and become very active again, and people would gather. They didn't want to waste a lot of their resources, so maybe a group of neighbors would gather around one or two candles and do things like quilting or some kind of communal activity, and then they'd have a second sleep. Just,
Interesting.
and night was so much more mysterious to people then, like you couldn't see if you went outside, and so night was the abode of robbers and unsavory sorts and wild animals. And so there's a lot more fear, I think, connected with the night.
What's that book called?
Um, I have it on my shelf right behind me. I think it's called At Day's Close.
At
If,
Day's Close. I got to pick that up. That sounds
if you
familiar.
got a second, I'll stand up and take a quick.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see.
At Day's Close.
Where is it? Of course, now I'm not seeing it. It's somewhere right up in here, but oh dear. Well, I'm
That's
pretty sure I
okay.
have the title. I'm pretty sure I have the title right anyway.
Okay,
And
At Day's Close.
his name is E. Roger E. Kirk or E. Kirch.
E. Roger
And then E.
Ekerts.
Kirk is Ekirch.
Okay,
Yeah. So
great. I'm gonna
you
get a
can find
copy
it.
of that. That sounds right up my alley.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. But yes, the diction to I'm fascinated by the diction of the Old West in the 1800s, and I really admire it when books and movies get it right. I think a great example is the Coen brothers remake of True Grit. It's just a joy to listen to the characters speak in that movie because I think it does it very well. And I'm sure that's a reflection on Charles Portis's novel, True Grit, because
Yeah.
I think the lines are pretty faithful to the novel. Um, but it's this combination of course, kind of rural dialect, but also if people had any education, it was pretty lofty. Like in their one-room schoolhouses, they might have been reading these eclectic readers, maybe some Latin, the classical
Shakespeare.
Roman poets and things. And so you get this combination of lofty and rural, and it's
Right.
really fascinating. I read a pioneer diary because when people were moving west, newspapers encouraged these pioneers to keep diaries, and newspapers back east would publish them often in a serial form. And so I read a diary of her name was Sarah Raymond Herndon, and it's called Crossing the Plains. And she traveled across the plains by covered wagon in 1865 with her family. And so there's no substitute for a firsthand source,
All
someone
right.
of the times writing and how they thought, the words they put it into. Like, for example, she wouldn't say only, she would say not but. So, like, we camped not but a mile from the river, or something like that. Or she wouldn't go to a store, she would call at a store or call at a shop. So,
Right.
just things like that, if you can throw them in, the dialogue gets a lot more realistic. And then I also watched a series of Appalachian videos on YouTube about Appalachian culture and expressions and language, and things like that can help a lot too. So
Was they didn't use contractions as much as we do, right?
at least that's my impression.
I
I don't know
cannot,
if that's
you know,
100% true or if that's kind of our
our
impression.
perception of it, because you're right, it's this really interesting mix of more formal, elevated language and
Yeah.
homespun kind of patois.
Yes, yes. And I
Yeah,
grew up among farmers in the Midwest too. And I don't know that the language has changed all that much. I mean, certain expressions, certainly, but people still kind of talk about the same things. And, they're kind of in the Midwest, deferential and polite and reflective.
right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a little bit about what else can we say about this book without giving too much away?
Let's see.
Um, I don't think we want to say too
I,
much more.
right. We don't want to say too much. I don't know if we fully want to get into this or not, but I think the question of theme is really interesting. And theme is something that I didn't notice until I had finished writing the book, but I think it does have a pretty distinct theme that keeps recurring through the book, and it's not something I planned. I don't know if it's a spoiler to say what that is or not, but
No, yeah, why don't you actually?
go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, I just noticed when I finished writing it, and just a couple days ago, actually, I noticed this for the first time, but how much it's about the idea of going home. First of all, you've got this title, The Country Under Heaven. And on one level, that refers to the wide, beautiful lands of the Wild West. It
Right.
feels like this beautiful country under heaven with the sunset shining on it, that sort of thing. But I think on another level, it's talking about Ovid's philosophy, how he is, uh, wherever he goes and the people he meets, he kind of brings his spirit of calm and peace to these people, kind of this equanimity. He is there, like I said, he's almost like a pastor in his just steadiness and his calm. And where he finds things broken, he tries to put them back together. And that's pretty timely because, in Ovid's time, the land was still reeling from the Civil War. There were still these deep divides among people. And, if that doesn't sound a lot like the times we live in,
Sure does.
so I think it's maybe the right time for a book like this. Um, but yeah, just let's see, where was I was talking about theme? Yes,
Mm,
and the idea of going home. Um, the first chapter is called "The Fresh Air Above," and as we read the chapter, that comes from a quote that comes up in that chapter from it's from Virgil's Aeneid, the old, the Aeneid of Virgil,
sure.
the Roman poet. The idea that the way into the underworld is easy. Wide is the door to dark Avernus. Day and night, death's door is open wide. But to return to the fresh air above, to return to the world of light, that is a feat. That is an undertaking. And really, that's what Ovid is trying to do through the book. He's trying to get over the pain and turmoil of the war and this crather which is following him, which in some ways almost seems to be a personification of death in a way, or
Mhm.
something. We're not fully sure. Until the end, we learn a little bit more about it. Um, but so Ovid is, trying to get back to the light and helping other people go toward the light in a
Right.
sense. And then
Now,
it's in every chapter of the book. There's always somebody or something that's trying to go home,
mm,
and that's really interesting because that was not a conscious choice on my part.
wow, that is interesting. And obviously, the character's first name, Ovid, that it's very intentional. Ovid Vesper, I'm assuming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I think Ovid's best known, of course, for the Metamorphoses,
Right. Yes.
right? And so, what's your take there? Is that he's going through a metamorphosis of his own?
That is a good point. I'm not sure I thought about that right away when I came up with the name. I'm sure I thought about it at some point, but mainly I was trying to create a name that sounded like a name in the Old West. People
Right.
often had these really classical sounding names like Virgil and Hercules and things like that.
A lot
So
of Ulysses.
yeah, yeah, a lot of Ulysses. Um, and of course, biblical names and things like
Sure,
that. And then
sure.
Vesper is, well, that maybe is a bit of a stretch. That's taken from the old church canonical hours. And they would have different church services at different times of day, starting in the morning. And then Vespers was the evening service, like
Okay.
sort of early evening. So it's just this kind of feeling of sundown, and again, like the country under heaven, like he's not quite in heaven yet, but we're on the porch in a way.
Right.
Ovid sees heaven's light shining through, I think, in various ways.
Gotcha. Yeah. Um, so let's talk a little bit about some of your previous work as well. You've published 3 other novels.
Well, the most recent one was A Green and Ancient Light, and it's a very different kind of book from this one. It's a story of it's kind of a coming of age story in a way. It's set during a war that seems to be World War II, but the book never really says. And it's a situation where the main character is this little boy who is sent out of the city so that he's away from the fighting and away from possible bombings to live with his grandmother. and he's if he's met her, it's only like been once or twice, and he doesn't remember her at all. And so it's the summer he spends with his grandmother. He's getting to know her. And then at the same time, they discover a mystery in the forest near her house. There's an abandoned garden of statues, and the statues are all these mythological figures overgrown by the forest, but they all have inscriptions on their pedestals. And they begin to realize that there seems to be some kind of riddle encoded in these inscriptions. So they're trying to solve that mystery. At the same time, they run into an enemy soldier who has been shot down, and they make the decision to keep him hidden and secret and nurse him back to health. So they're trying to elude the local military officers, trying to keep their patient secret, trying to solve this mystery. And it's just a magical summer story. So, as you can see, very different from the book at hand. And
Yes, but it
back
sounds like
farther, yeah, I have a book for children, a middle grade reader called The Star Shard, which is more completely in the realm of fantasy. And
okay.
then all the way back, my first novel, we were talking about the pulp era. My first novel was published by Arkham House,
Oh,
which is
really?
a small publisher created to publish the works of H.P. Lovecraft, basically.
Right.
So yeah, my first book came out from Arkham House, and it's called Dragonfly. And again, it's kind of a dark fantasy. So
Has it been reprinted?
no, let's see. It came out from Arkham House, and then Ace Fantasy did a reprint,
Okay.
and this has been a while back now. And then
Okay.
it's picked up by the SF Book Club, but right now it's out of print, and I'd like to see it. We might try to find some way to bring it back into a new edition.
Is there an ebook version of it available?
I don't think so on Dragonfly.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you're curious, you can still find editions of it floating around. If you find the old Arkham House edition, that's really a collector's item now. It's
Right.
cover by Jason Van Hollander, and he won the World Fantasy Award in the year that he illustrated Dragonfly. Now I don't know if it was entirely for the Dragonfly illustration, but he had done a lot of good fantasy illustrations. His covers are pretty recognizable. You can see, if you see one across the room, oh, that's Jason Van Hollander.
Right. Right. Now, you taught for, was it 20 years in Japan?
Yes.
It's probably maybe hard to articulate it, but that experience, or at least living in Japan and being in that culture,
Mm-hmm.
has to have made its way into your creative work in some way. We see
Yes.
it a little bit in this book, actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. How do you see it in this book?
Well, isn't there a reference to, there's a Japanese,
That's right. Okay, I know what you're
right?
talking about. Yeah, where
Yeah,
the one guy has uh, sailed when Admiral Perry opened up Japan to the west.
exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it's definitely influenced me. I think, for one thing, just being outside our country and living in a very different culture for a time, you just, I think, learn to think more flexibly and see different viewpoints, and you understand how a really different language works. So I think just that, the experience of being a foreigner in a culture that's pretty homogenous, where you really stand out as a foreigner, I'm sure that has helped my writing in a lot of ways.
In a culture that doesn't have a Judeo-Christian background, right?
That too, yes.
It's a very different, different kind of things, you know, like, shame or honor or big
Right.
Japanese culture. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the comparison is often, or the analogy people often use, is that it's more of a horizontal culture. Like
Hmm.
the important relationships are you to other people. So, you don't want to inconvenience others, you don't want to embarrass your family, it's all
Right.
these relational concerns. Whereas I think in the West, in the Judeo-Christian culture, we have a more vertical orientation. Like we are under God, and we have a responsibility maybe to our creator. uh,
Yeah,
I don't know. There's not that strong sense in Japan for the most part.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, so were you teaching literature or English there?
I was mostly teaching ESL, English as a second language,
Okay.
but I did get to teach some creative writing in that context also, which I loved. But yeah, mainly it was ESL, um, which was fun. But the great thing about it is that it also allowed me a lot of time to write. When
Mhm.
you're on a university schedule, you're not busy all day every day. So
Right.
it was great to go hand in hand with writing.
Now, are you able to write full time now, or do you have a day job?
I still have a day job. It's just part-time though. I teach part-time at a school for the performing arts. So I teach creative writing to high school students,
Oh,
and I
wow.
really love that.
Oh, that's great. Are you discovering some raw talent out there?
Some kids are doing some pretty amazing things, and especially at this school where a lot of them are in our department because they want to do this. They want to
Yeah,
learn to be writers. So it's
right.
really a joy to teach that, and I think it's good for writers to pass that along, to do what we can to help the next generation come up and be the next generation of writers.
Definitely. What about, I know this book just came out yesterday, but I'm sure you've got something in progress.
Well, first is the sequel to this book, which is
Oh,
actually already written. I have
oh,
the
really?
sequel finished. And so I'm really hoping and praying that the same publisher will publish the sequel because I'd like them to look similar. I'd like them to be packaged in similar ways. But of course, publishers want to see how a book does before they commit to a sequel often. Uh,
Okay.
so I'm hoping if fans like this book, I'm hoping they will snow the publisher under with requests and demands for a sequel.
Well, Melville House is such a great press. I mean, I really admire what they do,
Yes.
and Michael Barson, who's the one that put us in touch. He's
Yes.
an old friend, and
Oh,
and you know, I've done a number of Melville House related events that,
okay.
he's the one who made me aware of the book in the first place. So thanks so much, Michael. Um, yeah, I hope they buy number two.
I hope so too.
What can you tell us about it?
Okay. So it's um if you read book one, you know that book one comes to a resolution at the end.
Yeah.
And so book two is told from another character's perspective. It's not Ovid Vesper.
Oh,
Ovid Vesper is a character in the book. So it's a story that's happening simultaneously with Ovid's.
oh my gosh.
Another person who's also traveling in the West. Um, don't want to say too much, but it's a character we meet in book one.
I have my guess on who it might be.
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, you
Yeah,
might. I think you might, especially, if you look at the last chapter of
yeah,
this
yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that I think you're on the right track.
So it's
So
kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead sort of
maybe,
idea.
maybe, yeah.
Do you know that story?
A little.
The
I'm not
story
really
of this,
familiar with
the
it.
story of Hamlet as told through these two minor
Yeah.
characters. So
Okay.
all the events you see in the main play are happening kind of off to the side.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Really, really cool idea.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But this other character has a completely other story too. So, it's it's fun. In a lot of ways, I think I took what I learned in writing the first Ovid Vesper, his story, and used it in the second book. I personally feel the second book is actually better. It's a
Wow.
bigger story, and by the time we get to the end of it, we know this other character's whole life from early childhood to very old age.
Oh, wow.
And it's told in a way that's not completely chronological. There's a kind of real time of the story in 1887 and 1888, but
Okay.
then other alternating chapters go back to this character's childhood and takes the character through life, and ultimately catching up to the present storyline.
I love that kind of story, you know.
I really had fun writing it. And it was another one that was pretty easy to write. These characters are just so strong in my mind that these are probably the easiest two book experiences I've had yet.
That's great. Have is there an audiobook of this?
Of
Of
this first book.
No, of Country Under Heaven? It's
Yeah.
got
Let me think here. So much is happening very quickly. I I don't know that there is yet, but that's
something's
sorry, I don't really
something's in
know.
the works.
I have to ask myself.
You're like, I just write these books. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a time when so much is going on, and I've been
Very
doing some
exciting.
interviews and writing things, and I'm pretty sure it's in the contract that we're doing an audiobook too. So
That would be really awesome.
yeah.
Do you know if the book is sold in Europe at all? Is it sold? I mean, the French would absolutely love this book in
Oh,
particular.
really?
Yeah, there's a huge audience in France for books about the American West of all kinds.
Really? I
So
didn't know that.
if you haven't sold it, get your agent on it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the agent is, they're
Yeah.
they're really good about that. Like they find rights to sell that I don't even know exist.
Hey, that's great.
So agents are definitely worth their weight in gold and then some.
Right.
And I would also say the same of Melville House. I think you're absolutely right. It's the first time I've ever worked with a publicity team at a publisher, and they're wonderful and they're keeping me busy too. But
That's great.
that's great. I'm very grateful to them, to Michael
Yeah.
Barson and the others there.
Hmm. Yeah, great press. They really do. They publish such interesting books, and it's like, I would just kind of, read a Melville House book because they published it, just to see what it was like, and kind of sometimes that takes me out of my usual type of book that I think that I enjoy reading.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
so
And that's also something kind of miraculous too, because Melville House is primarily known as a literary publisher. Is that correct from your understanding?
I guess whatever that
Yeah, I mean
means.
they do a lot of pretty serious literary work. So for my book to be taken on by Melville House is kind of a small miracle. At least I think so, because my book is so heavily genre. Now, certainly it
But
has some
also
literary
very, there's
aspects
very
to it.
literary. It's very literary too.
Okay, well, thank you for
Yeah,
saying so.
yeah.
I, I have the sense that it's maybe a kind of a new direction, or they were taking a chance on it, because it's not just literary.
No, I mean and the cover design is really brilliant. I love the cover.
Yeah,
Really
I do too.
terrific. Well, Fred, it's been a treat to talk with you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Likewise, you.
and congratulations on the book. If you're ever out here in the desert, give me an advance word and we'll set up something here at the bookstore for you.
I sure will.
Maybe
Yeah,
for book two, we could get you out here.
I'd love to visit there. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I really appreciate you doing a podcast like this.
absolutely. Yeah.
That really does
These
a
are the
lot
kind of
to.
things that I enjoy doing the most, frankly. Because we have a lot of big, celebrity kind of events that
Uh,
we have to do, and but
yeah.
this is a great literary novel like this is right up my alley, and I love to support this kind of book.
Well,
So,
thank you.
um, so there you have it, folks. The Country Under Heaven. It's out today. Um, Go to your local independent bookstore or wherever you can find the book. Get a copy. You'll love it. And we do have copies here at the Poison Pen. And again, congratulations, Fred.
Thank you. Thank you
All right.
very much.
Okay, we'll talk to you
Pleasure,
soon then.
pleasure to be here. Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.